Hello everyone, my name is Brian Quan. I join you from Canada and I serve at the Toronto Chinese Mennonite Church. And welcome to episode 2 and lesson 2. And today's title is Freedom from For. Freedom from For. It's a little bit of a curious title, and you may have wondered, how does it relate to today's scripture in Exodus 15? Well, after reviewing the lesson material, the theme came into focus for me. Freedom from For means that Jesus frees us from our darkness and our bondage. And this freedom isn't given to us just to enjoy in our private space. No, freedom calls us to something greater. Freedom calls us to and for a reason. We are called for God's witness of peace and reconciliation. This would be the practical takeaway for today's lesson. We are freed for God's ongoing work of peace and reconciliation in this world. So encourage your students to pay attention to ways that God would prompt them to work towards His peace. So my reflections will be primarily on the passage in Exodus. The metaphors that we see here are ones of celebration and joy. Joy over the death and the enemies at God's hands. And these are quite unsettling images, but they form the lyrics of a victory song, a song that expresses deep, deep emotion, feelings of liberation, being set free and overcoming. And most of us can relate to these feelings. In our contemporary culture, we have many popular victory songs. So you might want to ask your students about their favorite victory songs. Here are some songs that come to my mind. We have We Are the Champions by Queen, Roar by Katy Perry, and Nothing's Gonna Stop Us Now by Starship. And you might want to ask them to look up the lyrics and compare and contrast different ways that people have overcome. If you compete in any sport team, you're familiar with these feelings. And there's a classic song from the 1969, and it's titled Na 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 Na, Hey Hey, Goodbye. So you're probably more familiar with the tune, especially if you're a hockey fan and you've heard it being chanted, usually at a playoff game. And the victory song is not sung so much to celebrate the winner. Instead, it's more gloating over, taking delight over the losing team, waving them goodbye. And victory songs, they really do communicate deep human emotion. And this is what we see here in Exodus 15. It's a fitting response for God's liberation of His people in slavery. And the words are very vivid and very strong. Verse 7 and 8. The greatness of your majesty, you overthrew your adversaries. You sent your fury, it consumed them like stubble. At the blast of your nostrils, the water piled up, the flood stood up in a heap. How can you help your students discuss this thorny issue of God's people rejoicing over the violent death of the Egyptians? There are some challenging questions in the lesson plan, and I think it's helpful to ask them. For example, does God use violence to bring about His saving acts? So these are very complex questions, and they are complex, and you probably don't have enough time to deal with them in this lesson. So if you sense your students needing more time, give them time after class to chat. You may not have the answers for them, but it's very helpful that you're listening and walking with them through their difficult questions. I read an excellent scholarly paper on addressing this passage as it pertains to this violent text. If you want to search it up, there's a PDF, and it's called The Riverbank, the Seashore, and the Wilderness: Miriam, Liberation, and Prophetic Witness Against Empire. So here are the helpful things that I've gleaned from this paper. First of all, the song that Miriam is singing is not a battle song, because Exodus 14 is not a military battle. It's not about Israel's military strength, military tactics. It's not about how many horses, how many spears, or how many chariots. No, it's about God's intervention. The song was sung to remind the people of their helplessness and their trust in the power of God. So when we say that God fights for their battles, it means that Israel does not take up arms. It was God not in the water, but He was above it, controlling it. The second thing, you might want to ask the students if they see this passage as one of protest. This is somewhat of a song of protest. It speaks against Pharaoh, against his power and his forces, which say the gods are on our side. But this is not so. The song shows how God sided with the weak, the oppressed, and he lifts them up. Third, you might want to ask your students how they view God. How does the Jewish image of a warrior king fit with their understanding? Well, in the eyes of Miriam, God was not like a human warrior who was brash and arrogant and seeking to prove his power and might over his people. No, not at all. God demonstrated his radical love for his own people under slavery. On page 9, the topic of violent tactics. You might want to talk about the tools of oppression. It's not uncommon for the oppressed to turn around and to become the oppressor. And when the tables turn, they're now in this place of privilege, and then power is often used in those oppressive ways. So the challenge is to find new tools, to find that third way, that non-violent option to bring hope and reconciliation. Well, these are my insights for this lesson. I hope you find them helpful in your lesson planning. Have a great lesson with your students, and we'll see you next time.